right, welcome everyone to WURD. It is Progressive Black Talk Media, of course, and you are now hearing the voice of Charles Ellison. I am normally your host, executive producer, and creator of Reality Check, also managing editor, host of Eco Word Magazine. We're actually having a special live broadcast today, a special live broadcast on education. It is the 68th anniversary. We are actually commemorating, observing, also thinking very deeply about the 68th anniversary of the landmark Supreme Court decision called Brown versus Board of Education. That happened in 1954. And of course, as many of you know, especially if you've been reading those history books, if you paid attention in history class, that forever changed the face of the American K through 12 education landscape. So we need to have a very important education conversation this week. We've been having bits and pieces of it this week. We always have education conversations here, especially on Reality Check. And it's a very important conversation that we do need to have. And so we're presenting to you a special broadcast, a special discussion with some experts and also legislators, former and current, that we've invited to break down exactly what is the state of American K through 12 education and what do we do about it? Because it is in a fairly broken state. It's also in a fairly inequitable state. And so, how do we fix it? We're going to talk about that here today on WURD. So, we presented this very special broadcast, which you will get exclusively nowhere else but on WURD. We are doing that in conjunction with our partners. Of course, as you know, the Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference has a council on communities of color, of which I'm a senior fellow. And they're always kind enough to partner up with us for these very special live broadcasts and conversations. WM Page, I just want to give her a quick shout out, thanking her for making these types of micro summits, these equitable governance summits, always possible, and producing them or providing them here on WURD. Also, want to thank Stride Learning, who provides virtual learning products and services and curriculum, also helping make this powering this conversation as well. So really appreciate that too. So we have a live broadcast going on. There are multiple people who have joined in as participants, as audience in the Zoom part of the platform that we're using today. I would just ask that those who are non-panelists in the Zoom keep your cameras off. Also keep your audio on mute. But if you have questions during the course of this conversation, please leave them in the Zoom group chat. For those of you listening on radio and watching us on Word TV, you can relay questions during the course of this conversation. I'll be keeping an eye open for that. You can email me at cellison@wordradio.com. You can also catch me on Twitter, direct message me, or tag me on Twitter at Ellison Report. And we're going to use hashtag CSG East for the purpose of this conversation. And a little bit later on, we'll have open phone lines after we talk with our esteemed panelists today. So let's go ahead and introduce them, and then we'll get the conversation started. We have with us New York Assembly Member Alicia Heineman. She represents the 29th Senatorial District in the state of New York. Also works on education matters, sits on the education committee there sorry, not the senatorial district, but the 29th legislative district in the state. Excuse me for that, assembly member.
You elevated me.
New York. I elevated you, right, right. So let's see, maybe that'll happen. Maybe that magically you'll just appear as State Senator Elisa. But she's Assemblywoman in the New York State Assembly, sits on their education committee, works on education issues. Thank you for joining us here, giving us some of your time this morning, Assembly Member. Also, former legislator uh, who was a senator, a Colorado State Senator, Angela Williams. She joins us from Nashville, Tennessee, and she's now an executive at Stride Learning, Government Affairs, and also Public Affairs there, Government Relations and Public Affairs there at Stride Learning. More at stridelearning.com. She joins us here today. Good to see you, Senator, always. And Rand Miller. Rand Miller is a diversity, equity, inclusion expert. He's based in Camden, New Jersey, also founder of the Urban Education Mixtape. And he joins us here occasionally on WURD for Reality Check. He's been on a few other WURD shows, writes for the Philadelphia Inquirer, also has written for the B Note on a few occasions. So it's good to see him here as well. Zachary Wright is a Philadelphia educator, also award-winning Philadelphia educator that is. Check out his book when you get a moment, Dismantling a Broken System. We've had him on here a couple of times, and Zach is also an upcoming contributor on thebnote.com. He's actually going to, we actually have our editor prepared to have that posted there sometime today. So do go to the B Note, THEBE to check out some of his analysis assessment op-eds that'll be there on a regular basis as well. So let's go ahead and start that conversation. Assemblywoman, I'm going to start with you just to get your sense of, we're talking about Brown v. Board of Ed. We're talking about the state of American K through 12, especially as it impacts Black students and other students of color as well. What is the state of education now? It just as you assess it when you're looking at your state and you're also looking at the rest of the nation.
Well, it's interesting. I just read an article someone sent me, an op-ed, and what I feel, forgive me that I don't remember the names right now, but in New York State, in light of the shooting, the massacre in Buffalo, I'm really assessing education in New York State, and I feel that we have a ways to go when it comes to the curriculum that we offer children, the positions that we offer Black professionals in education. I feel we're at an all-time low, and that if legislation, because we can't rely on school districts to do the work, because this individual was only 18 and came out of a school system that obviously was teaching something, but not necessarily American history as we know it should be taught. So I feel that the education system in New York and around the country is in a position where something has to be done very quickly to educate individuals on accurate American history, as well as really wholeheartedly moving the needle that school districts around the country hire Black teachers in the education system, not just for Black children, but for white children. And the op-ed I read talked about since the landmark legislation of Brown v. Board of Education, there has been a consistent effort to reduce the number of Black professionals in front of our children. And I see that it's still continuing. So we have a lot of work to do in this country, in this state and this country.
Yeah, absolutely have to have a lot of work to do. That's one thing. That's one of the negative impacts that a lot of people have been starting to talk about more and more of Brown v. Board of Ed. So, obviously there was some positive impacts, but some negative impacts. We suddenly saw the disappearance of Black teachers, Black educators. So we have and other educators of color as well. We have a majority student of color population in American education now, and we have very few educators of color. Senator Williams, to go to you as far as just your sense of, as we're looking at 68 years later, we're looking at the state of American K through 12 education, and you worked on education issues quite extensively in the state of Colorado, and especially representing your district there in Denver Metropolitan. So talk about that, like your sense of like what American education looks like right now.
Well, thank you, Charles. I think that, the state of education since the Brown versus the Board of Education was a landmark. I mean, it changed the landscape of education for our Black children across the country. I think that the state of education right now in our country still has a lot of, it is still segregated in a lot of ways. And while we had the Brown versus the Board of Education that I think was more like the physical presence of our Black children integrating schools, is that there's still a lot of segregation, and education right now is still it's in disarray. The inequities of learning opportunities, the inequities of resources, the inequities in access. Those are the strong conversations that we need to continue to have in this country, and how we provide equitable education for students all across this country. And then when it's layered with the pandemic, that threw, education into a flux, and a lot of parents and educators and teachers across the country are reassessing what does education look like. And so I'm so glad that we're having this conversation today as we try to move forward with resources and conversations and changing the conversation about what education looks like for our students today.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's real important. Yeah, there is right, Zach, there is this reassessment that's happening, especially among Black parents, brown parents, parents of color. As we've gone through pandemic, they've been realizing some things maybe they didn't realize before, as they were looking at, just the state of the education system that their kids are in. Maybe things that they were realizing before all the time, but now they're being a lot more vocal about it. But go ahead, Zach, your assessment on like the state of education, especially as your book covers it in dismantling a broken system.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, everyone. To me, education in America is commoditized and therefore inherently unjust. The vast majority, as we know, of schools are funded based upon the local property tax wealth. And as such, wealthy communities have resource schools and less wealthy neighborhoods do not. The thing about the commoditization, therefore, is that everyone purchases access to the school community that they can afford. And that just self-perpetuates an unjust system, particularly when you compound that with racist residential redlining and segregation. You have built-in systems of inequity that just self-perpetuate. To me, that is the crux of the issue. And until we face the fact that everyone is buying what they can afford in terms of education through either tuition, test prep for magnet schools, or through their homes, until we understand and really address that fact, then we have a huge amount of work to do. Because at the moment, it's quality education is there if you can afford it. And that is inherently an unjust racist practice.
Rand, your thoughts on that too? With Zach saying it's deeply commoditized. It just depends on the zip code. It depends so much nowadays, the quality of the education on the zip code you live in, how much money you have to navigate that system, whether you want to stay in public school system or then, okay, well, I'm going to have this option. I want to go over to this private school since this is not the quality education I want my child to have. But your sense of like what it looks like, and then what Senator Williams was saying, like we have a system in disarray here. And so we've got to have a different, better, bolder conversation on K through 12 education. Go ahead, Rand.
So we live in a capitalist society, and in capitalism, there are always going to be winners and losers. And so to Zach's point, there are winners and losers with respect to who gets a quality education. But then that also gets flipped with respect to Black education, because many of our folks will, think, and that's not on them, but rather because of the way society is set up, that white schools or suburban schools are better than urban schools. And that's not necessarily the case, because our students will go to suburban schools and they will encounter a level of racism. They'll encounter a lack of Black teachers, and they will encounter a decentering. They're not being centered. They're not being centered really in a lot of places. That's neither here nor there, but they're certainly not being centered in those schools. And so it really begs the question, are those schools providing something better for Black children? And that's sort of the war that a lot of Black parents have. And that stems back to the earlier comment on Brown versus the Board of Education. We know that sort of created this situation where Black teachers, Black principals were either demoted or released from duty because there was really no integration. It was just assimilating Black students into white schools. And we know the data on that with Black teachers in particular, Black students are more likely to graduate, go to college, less likely to be disciplined, less likely to be retained for the next year. So with that, I also want to add, as a history teacher, the reality too is that the challenge that we have is to confront the white supremacy and systemic racism that we see in society that's perpetuated through our policies and through our postures in the classroom. A lot of the attention goes to English and math, which I think is important, but a lot of that is geared towards standardized testing. And we know that with standardized testing that Black students tend to perform worse than anyone else. And I do not think that that is by accident. It is not because our students are incapable, but I believe it's because those tests are not the best indicators of what our students know and how they can perform. And so I believe that more attention ought to be given towards civics. We don't have enough of that with respect to teaching the true history. I believe that Assemblywoman Hyman said that. I echo those sentiments. We need to do that, not just for Black students, but for white students, for all students. And so the lack of Black teachers for our young people, the overemphasis on standardized testing, echoing what Zach said about the way that people buy education, and then the lack of civics education, the true history of the United States. Those are challenges for our students. Those are challenges for everybody. And that's where we are, because we have a constituency of folks that are fighting to keep those things the way they are.
We're now having a special broadcast. This is a live exclusive panel here on WURD, and it is being done in partnership with Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference, Council on Communities of Color, and also Stride Learning. For more on CSG, go to csg-erc.org. For Stride Learning, you can go to stridelearning.com. I'm Charles Ellison, here having this Getting Schooled conversation. How do we have a better education conversation here in America? The better education conversation, for real, it's not critical race theory. It's not, mass mandates. It's about exactly the curriculum, the level of literacy reading. We've been having a big conversation here on Reality Check about very alarming rates of illiteracy in places like Philadelphia and elsewhere, especially among our Black students. So we have joined here, you just heard Rand Miller, Urban Education Mixtape. Before him, it was Zachary Wright, author of Dismantling a Broken System, and former Colorado State Senator Angela Williams, also now an executive government affairs, public affairs at Stride Learning, and New York Assembly member Alicia Hyman has also been joining us as well. We're going to take a quick break. For those who are in the Zoom platform, please continue to keep your, I really appreciate that too, keep your cameras off, stay on mute. But if you have questions, you can leave them there in the Zoom group chat. For those of you in our Word broadcast audience, you can send me an email at cellison@wordradio.com or tag me at Ellison Report on twitter.com, or direct message me if you already follow me. So go ahead and leave those questions like that. We're going to use hashtag CSG East, especially on Twitter, for the social media conversation there. Let's take a break, and we'll be right back with more of our Getting Schooled conversation here on WURD. Oh, we're coming right back. We're actually going to do no commercials. That's fine. Okay, great. Appreciate that. That's even better. So we're back at it here on our Getting Schooled conversation. Thanks so much for tuning in and listening. And so, Assemblymember, I'll go back to you as far as the trend now is that we're seeing more students of color than white students, especially in public K through 12. Are we seeing sort of a parallel trend where as we're having more student of color, Black, Brown, Indigenous, API, Asian Pacific Islander students in our schools, in our school systems. So we're also seeing a drop in the quality of the education. That leads to a question that we did get from CSG East, Council of Communities of Color. Let's talk about for example, the dumbing down of curriculum in communities of color that has taken place since Brown. Go ahead, Assemblymember.
That's a great question. And I'll give you an example. I have an 11-year-old who's in public school, and the state exams just took place. And she came home, she said, yeah, it was really easy. And as much as I would like to say my child is, adequately prepared, I feel that the double periods of math, the double periods of the English language arts, takes away from the learning of the music, which music to me is academic. Learning a foreign language is instrumental. I think it even helps you understand English grammar. I definitely feel there and have witnessed a dumbing down in curriculum. And I think it's because we want better test results, and it looks better if everyone's passing, particularly students of Black and Latino students in education because the scores are better. So we gotta be doing better because the kids are passing. And especially as we know, there's always a drop in middle school grades when it comes to the core subjects, math and the English language arts. I witness it anecdotally, but then in speaking to other parents and being a legislator gives me a bird's eye view that there is definitely inherent dumbing down that we know we're competing on a universal global market, and children that attend schools in this country are not meeting the standards of in a global market. It truly worries me. I do my due diligence with children and have really fundamentally started an education work group in my assembly district with over 200 parents participating to make sure we raise the level of education in our public schools in this part of Queens, New York. So.
Yeah, Senator Williams, too. This is a good question from Caroline Casagrande, who is tuning in through our Zoom audience, and she's asking, like, what lessons do leaders in education need to take from the pandemic for communities of color? And so, looking at, kind of like the quality of education during pandemic since Brown v. Board of Ed, I think it's a good question. Thank you, Caroline. Go ahead, Senator.
Well, thank you. Again, since the pandemic has hit us, and this country has had a disarray in the education system. But in regards to what we need to take away from that, our education leaders from the pandemic to communities of color, is that number one, we know that there were more inequities that were exposed. And we know that we have less teachers for a lot of different reasons who are not in the classroom or they're not teaching. And that taught them a lot about, with this health issue that we had. But in taking messages to the communities of color is that number one, it raises the elevation of equity in education, right? And access to resources. And I think the biggest one is access to technology in order to deliver education. That's the biggest learning. And how do we educate more of our parents on the value of distance learning and how the technology is a very important part of their lives and moving forward. And so we have to continue to push for the FCC to give more funding, to have broadband access, right? And not only do we have to teach our kids about education and powering education through technology, but we also have to educate the parents. And so I think that since Brown versus the Board of Education, technology has started to play a whole new role in the 21st century, which didn't exist since Brown versus Board of Education. It didn't exist then, so that how we deliver education looks very differently in the 21st century. So I would say that's one of the number one things we need to think about as we take messages to communities of color is the advantage of having access to technology and broadband and how we deliver education to our children.
It's a very good point, Senator. Yeah, go ahead, Zach. Talk about that a bit. Because we're in this moment, right, where there is an expectation, or we have like this great resignation going on, where people are like demanding remote options for work. So we expect that, or there has been an expectation in the workplace in terms of productivity, efficiency. Actually, we saw a much more productive, efficient workplace during pandemic because of remote work. So there's an expectation that we should continue with that. Not so much, right? I mean, as far as the education system is concerned, we leverage the technology in every other industry and sector, but we don't want to seem to do that and provide the resources for that in the K through 12 system. I'd like to get your thoughts on that, Zach.
Yeah, there's so much said that there are so many ideas here. So because education has a huge inertia, problem, right? Because we all go to school, it's hard for anything to change. So a couple of things top of mind. One of the, I think, major lessons from the pandemic, twofold. One is the resilience of children. They are far more resilient than the adults. And they did it and showed up and have done it. So the resilience of the children, I think, is extraordinary. I think another lesson from the pandemic is that we collectively as a nation, when we decide to apply resources to something, we can actually get things done. We created a vaccine in a year and a half because we said resources aren't the problem. We will throw resources at the problem, we will get this done. We could do that for other things. We could say, you know what, internet everywhere, period. Let's put the resources in and get it done. And we can make that happen. In the early 20th century, telephone lines were not ubiquitous, right? But it took the federal government to say, we are going to make this ubiquitous to make us nationally competitive. We can do the same for broadband. It's an investment in ourselves. And the last thing I want to say about the dumbing down the curriculum, this is where it comes back to having a non-diverse teaching force teaching diverse students. When you have a white teaching force teaching so many teachers of color, you have implicit biases that are going to come in. And the first thing that happens with implicit biases is a lowering of expectation. A lowering of expectation in terms of what students can achieve and what students are capable of. That's the first thing that white teachers need to unlearn. They need to understand that high expectations is love. High expectations is respect. High expectations plus supports and scaffolding, that is being an anti-racist co-conspirator. That is really doing the work. So there were so many ideas out there. I just felt I needed to touch on all of them. So
Yeah, no, that's some wonderful points. Go ahead, Rand. You jump in on the conversation too, and as far as and I did assembly member, I want to get to you too because I saw you nodding your head, especially on that broadband access point. But go ahead, Rand. As far as it's a good point that both the senator and Zach were making, as far as like and Zach too, saying like, hey, like we've been here before when we really wanted something. We do it when we wanted to do the moonshot, when we wanted to get to the moon, get a person on the moon. We did it. So it's like it's really just a matter of political and broader community will. Go ahead, Rand.
No, I was just going to say, I think that's a great point, but it goes to, I think, an even bigger point that is, there's not a priority on educating Black children. There's not a priority on educating American children in general. Zach is absolutely right. When America has the will politically to do something, we do it. And so the reason why it hasn't been done is again, to echo what I said earlier, we live in a capitalist society. Capitalists are not looking for people who are thinkers. They are looking for new workers to flood the system so that way profits can continue and folks can continue to be exploited. And so when we talk about the dumbing down of our students, it's not just Black students, it's all students. It's not just all students, it's teachers as well. The mention of there being a predominantly white teaching force, a lot of those teachers are unaware of the accurate history. I've given professional developments where in the midst of that, I've talked about true American history where teachers have said, largely white teachers, I've never heard of that. I've never learned of that. And that's not by accident. And so, to say it's a conspiracy, I would say that it's just the status quo, that this society is not looking for educated individuals because educated individuals will challenge it. It will challenge many of the conventions that we have that we consider normal. And it would require for the powers that be to make changes. And unfortunately, that's not happening. And so we see this dumbing down. My last point would be, in order to sort of address that, we have to get to a place where not just white teachers, but white administrators, school district leaders, that sort of thing, that they actually walk the walk, not just talk the talk. I think there's a lot of, yes, we need to do this, we need to do that, but there's a lack of recognition on how these individual actors perpetuate systemic racism in their districts where they work. And so if they're really interested in being anti-racist, I know that's the buzzword, but if they're really interested in knocking down systemic racism, it requires more than just an acknowledgement. It requires a dedicated response that may elicit some anger from people who look like them, but they have to be committed.
Got to be committed to that. Go ahead, Assemblymember. You were nodding your head earlier on, especially on that broadband access point.
I have to say that this pandemic really, I have been pushing this issue before, and now the pandemic made me push it even more. We were somehow happy with the $50 that the broadband industry was giving families during the pandemic. And we know it's a $1 billion industry. And just like telephones have been regulated, electricity, gas, I just think broadband is the next step. And I know I get pushback from Spectrum and Verizon, because when I was at a Senator Williams at a Nobel conference way across the country, when I got back to New York, I was like, oh, you said this about broadband in Chicago or Tennessee. So there is, when these companies making billions of dollars, and if you don't have access, if you're in a shelter, if you are a family that can't afford to pay the cable bill this month, or if you're a middle-class family that lost the overtime that you used to get because of the pandemic, now that's one more bill you're not going to pay. And what happens when you don't pay or don't have access to broadband? The dumbing down, to me, continues. The technology, like Angela said, is huge right now. Distance education. Pearson is doing commercials now about the curriculum that they're offering for remote learning. We understand how important access is. Access for communities of color to broadband is a problem. And I'm going to say it again, this is an industry where billions of dollars are being made. We really need to push this notion about regulating something that is necessary for you to continue in this society. And if we're talking about curriculum access across the country, you need access to the internet. You need access to broadband. Broadband needs to be a regulated a utility, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, go ahead, Zach. Looks like you got something.
I'm just thinking about Philly, right? The Comcast tower. Comcast centered in Philly, and when the pandemic hit, we had students and teachers go into parking lots to get their Wi-Fi, right? And the Comcast tower is having property tax abatements. What is happening? Like, who are we working for? And I also just think, largely as a nation, this is just not what smart nations do. Smart nations invest in themselves through the education of their young people. That is what smart nations do, and that's just not what we're doing.
Yeah, go ahead, Senator. Follow up on that, as far as, because it kind of sparked some, I want to explore that just a little bit further, especially, and we'll get into some other questions and some other comments. But, just that technology piece. I mean, we are in the 21st century. The technology is so essential, and there is an expectation that we leverage the technology for everything else. There's an expectation we all have smartphones. The cars that we're driving, we want them to be smart. We want the homes to be smart. We want everywhere to be smart, but we don't want the education system to be smart. Go ahead, Senator.
Well, as Zach said, we are the most technologically advanced country in the world. And for every household in this country not to have access to broadband is really a sad statement of where we are, particularly when it comes to how technology powers education. And Assemblywoman, I know you're as passionate about this as I am. And I want to add to the conversation that, we need to continue to push about access in the homes, but I also think it's very important that, even it could be an initiative by all of the major carriers in this country that not only are we giving you access to broadband, but there's an education piece there also, in that our families and our students understand the value of having access to the technology. I mean, in poor and low income communities, they probably have a cell phone, but the capabilities of it and the expansive access, they're just missing out on a lot in this country, and this country is powered by technology. So I would love to see us have a conversation also and bring the carriers to the table and say, not only do you need to give access, but you need to give some education to families and our students about the value of progressing, not only in education, but just in their lives in general. We talk about the inequities in this country, And I know this is an education conversation, but if our families don't have access to broadband and understand how that brings value to their lives, we might as well go back to Brown versus Board of Education, because, this is our time. Education is our civil rights issue now.
Rand, you had a quick comment right after the senator there. Thanks, Senator. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Rand.
yeah. I wanted to just piggyback on needing the Wi-Fi. Definitely, we need that, but we also, in addition to that, need access to the information. What I mean by that is continuing with the dumbing down of our students. I'm an academic. I think that our students need access to academic journals. They need access to academic resources that are costly, but that school districts can pay for. I'm currently working on a book now where I'm doing Black history for young people, and I can't say how priceless access to these academic journals and academic resources are to that. That's my first point. My second point is, real quickly, I'm gonna slide this in. Wi-Fi should be free and available, particularly for people who cannot afford those costs. I believe it was either the senator or assemblywoman that talked about how these businesses are multi-billion-dollar businesses, and yet we are nickeling and diming people. And so, yes, I think that there should definitely be that. And lastly, I'm gonna also say this too. I think that educators have to be reinventive. I believe it was the senator that talked about the cell phones. We can be creative with utilizing technology in the classroom. Cell phones are one thing. Young people understand that this world is ran by technology. Their lives are ran by technology, and yet we turn technology into an issue of policing them versus educating them. And I think that it's important for educators and policymakers alike to just think about the ways in which we utilize utilize technology to harm students as opposed to helping them.
Yeah, stop policing students, educate them. So no, it's a real good point. I do want to ask too, as far as kind of expounding on this a bit more. So we've identified like technology is a big issue here. Access to information. Well, we can't. I mean, especially when so much of the curriculum, so much of the information that students are required to access, to learn about, to sift through. So much of it is now online based. Gone are the days of learning because I remember those days, the Dewey Decimal System in your local library or in your school library. So now the new Dewey Decimal System is that online access, and that's going to be really important. I do want to just kind of going around Assembly Member now, talking a little bit more or expounding more on what are some of the most worrisome problems, keeping that technology piece in mind, of course, still. What are some of the most worrisome problems that you're seeing manifesting in the education system? One thing that I'm stunned that we're not having a conversation about are just the high rates of illiteracy in terms of reading proficiency. I think it's only 18% of Black eighth graders are reading proficient. Like how that's not a state of emergency right now is just stunning. It's boggling. So there's that low levels of math proficiency, science proficiency. Talk about that. Like what's keeping you up at night when you're thinking about the most worrisome aspects of K through 12 education today?
There's a lot that keeps me up at night, but particularly for education, there has been quite in our and I'm speaking for New York State, uptick in violence since the pandemic. We're seeing a lot more students that have been greatly affected by COVID, whether they're one parent died or both parents died, teachers that passed away, dealing with stress, and still telling these students these standards still apply. These measures, we understand that whatever happened to you as a whole student body was catastrophic. However, we're going to go right back like nothing happened and then give you the same measures that we deem successful and say you still have to do this. And this is on the federal level where they are still telling states that we need you to still give these exams, because if you don't do this, we're going to hold back billions of dollars from your state. And knowing that our children need mental assistance, not just the children, but the parents, the caregivers, and the teachers, we have seen that in addition to teachers are leaving the profession, not staying, no matter what race they are. The lack of empathy, I think, that has been given to teachers is catastrophic also since the pandemic. So I commend the teachers that are still showing up and doing the work. We just laid to rest a teacher, a Black male, a good friend of mine, 20 plus years in the classroom with children. And now children have to deal with, COVID is still here. We're still expecting our children and our teachers and our administrators to perform, knowing these things have happened, and not even delaying. I think we should have been on a pause while everyone comes back this year. We should have been allowing them to get their feet wet again and get back into the system without having so many measures put on them to still perform at levels pre-pandemic. I think that was unfair. That's what keeps me up.
Yeah, Senator Williams, you talk about that too, as far as like the impacts on the systems they had to, and just kind of also drawing from your experience dealing on working on education issues in a major metropolitan area in a major city like Denver, that had also, once again, very diverse, high rates of Black, brown students, also some indigenous Native American students as well. Just watching school systems, administrators, teachers recalibrate like that, trying to regain their footing, and how that's going. What you feel school systems need to do as they're going through that process?
Well, Charles, I want to say that, one of the things that keeps me up at night is that the number of children that are unaccounted for in our public school systems across this country. That's just a big worry for me. I think about it all the time. The kids that were going to brick and mortar schools and we were thrown into this remote environment, and it upset families. Who's tracking those kids that aren't returning to the public school system? And, I agree with Zach and everyone on the call. When there's a political will to address issues in this country and at our state and local levels, we do it. But I'm very, very concerned that no one's tracking those kids. Where are those kids? And there's a lot of efforts going on across this country to implement early ECE, early childhood education. First of all, we've got to get the kids back into the schools so we are able to address the inadequate proficiencies that we're talking about. But it's all about the resources and how school systems can deal with this. And I think that leads to a conversation of how do we get these kids back into their learning curricula, and what does that look like? And it's going to take innovative education like distance learning to get these kids back to in a learning environment. And parents are still trying to, I think they're still trying to evaluate that. They're trying to bring their families back together. The norm is not working, but what does that look like moving forward? And, Colorado is a very progressive state, one in which you can attend any type of school you like for your child, where you feel as though that learning environment is best for your child. And you can take that money and use it towards that type of education. So, that's the other conversation, is that when do we start funding students and listening to the parents and stop funding systems that we know is failing our students?
Go ahead, Zach.
The idea of what's the most worrisome to me, I don't mean to be pithy, but what worries me the most is whiteness as a caste. What worries me the most is the whiteness that is afraid and that is showing up at these school board meetings, talking about critical race theory, talking about this, that, and third, when they have no idea what they're talking about. That scares me. What also scares me is the whiteness that says, I put a yard sign up, so I'm good. There, to go back to what Mr. Miller said, we need to live up, people who look like me need to live up to our yard signs. We need to, for every voice that spews some nonsense about critical race theory, there needs to be someone who looks like me who's there to say, that's ridiculous. I want my white child to learn the truth. I want my white child to understand that they are benefits of privileges they have not earned, because that is not a dangerous thing for them to learn. That's truth. And if truth is dangerous to you, then what that really means is that you are just okay with the privileges that you have and you don't want it for anyone else.
Yeah.
What worries me is, and last thing, I'm sorry, Charles,
Go
what
ahead.
worries me is the whiteness as a caste that doesn't care about children that doesn't look like them.
Go ahead, Rand. So, yeah, like that's Zach made some real salient points there. Just to sort of further expound on that, like how dangerous is that? And so that shifts. That's the purpose of this conversation, because we're having like big national education conversations, not even talking about like these deep inequities or these real serious problems, the structural uh, maladjustments that we're going through, particularly that our communities are going through. It's just about hot button wedge issues that, in fact, are dealing with issues, things that don't even exist in the K through 12 education system, but they're the big headline, and we need to have this education conversation. Go ahead, Rand.
Yeah, I'll be quick. I'll just say one of the things that worries me is that we're going to go back to the way things were prior to the pandemic, as if those things were working prior to, particularly for Black students. So that
Yeah,
bothers me,
yeah.
that we're going to go back and do the same thing. And isn't that the definition of insanity? Doing the same thing, thinking it's going to work again,
Right.
that there's nothing's going to change. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing is, to earlier points made, the fact that there is a conscious understanding of, everything is racist. There's racism, but it's not me, and it's not necessarily systemic, because I'm here to help, that we can fix this. And there's a lack of desire to really make systemic changes that will impact white people in a way that makes them or their situations a little uncomfortable. But I'm going to take my last point into a different direction. I'm encouraged at the fact that this pandemic has, activated a lot of Black parents to reconsider the ways in which their children are being educated, to which where a lot of Black parents are now homeschooling their children more than ever before. And also there has been a recognition of Black parents about the racist nature of their schools, and they've taken their kids out of those schools, whether homeschooling them or placing them somewhere else. And so there is a level of understanding that, hey, these schools aren't working out. And even if they're not working out, in their current iteration, we have parents that are actually saying we'd rather do the remote learning, to the earlier point the senator made, because there are Black students who say, I can get my work done and do everything that I need to do, lack the racism, because I'm not in a school. So there are some things that we ought to consider. And so those things give me a little bit more hope in terms of how Black parents are looking at things. I think people think that Black parents are not sophisticated. Black people are some of the more sophisticated people in our society with respect to navigating an anti-Black society, a society that is meant based on their downfall and their exploitation. And so I think that parents particularly are looking at these things with a fine-tooth comb. They may not have the ability or access to really investigate due to the constraints of capitalism, but I do think that parents are really taking stock of what's going on and reassessing.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Go ahead, Assembly Member. And also, just going back to what the senator was saying earlier about like the number of children that are missing still, we still haven't accounted for from these school systems. Last count I saw was about 3 million plus children nationwide missing, unaccounted for. And so a lot of truancy officials, obviously, and others, social service folks are out there looking for those students. We still don't have a real good grasp or grip on the number of children out there who have been lost, foster children. There's a huge foster children crisis that's been brewing since pandemic, because a lot of children lost parents. They either lost one parent or they lost both parents. And obviously that exacerbates the problem. Go ahead, Assemblywoman.
2 points. The reason, I think some of the reasons why we're unable to locate children is because a lot of individuals have not returned to the workforce. Because if you're thinking about the remote if you're in New York City in the Department of Children's Services, a lot of them have not come back to work fully. And so trying to track down where children are has been an issue. Also, to Miller's point, a lot of parents have said, I'm not putting my, parents will take, and this is the thing, parents have been taking children out of schools because of racism, because they feel that certain teachers, and I've heard Black principals in my district say this, I've lost a couple kids, the teachers, I can't get rid of so and such teacher. The parent said, you know what, I'm taking my child out. And since the pandemic, a lot of parents created these pods where they're like, you know what, I'm going to continue to do this. I'm going to continue to homeschool. My child asked me to homeschool. I just didn't have the capacity to do that. I commend those parents who have. But those two things have taken, in New York City, we have 1.1 million school children. Approximately 100,000 children have not returned because they've chosen not to come back to the public school system. That speaks volumes. There's also 100,000 children in our charter schools, charter public schools in New York City. And some parents are just looking for alternatives where there's they feel their children are not caught in these racist policies. That's in New York City. We have a huge segregation problem. Our communities are segregated. Our schools are segregated. I live in a community, and thankfully that is more African-American than other parts of Queens, because a lot of us have bought our homes here. So it is going to be years, I feel, until an accurate accounting of what the pandemic has done to Black children, Latino children in public schools. But I can tell you right now, like Angela and Angela said, a lot of children are MIA, and we're going to really have to see where those children are, if the parents took them out for reasons, or if the parents, unfortunately, these children got lost in the system, because the pandemic is still decimating our workforce of individuals who refuse to come back to the office, and some individuals who refuse to be vaccinated. That has also multiplied the post-pandemic issues. Not post-pandemic, we're still in it, sorry.
We are still in it. or it's the endemic, as people would like to call it. As well, Senator, your thoughts too on how to strike that balance, right? Because okay, so a lot of there's a great resignation going. There's also not just a great resignation, but economic pressures, public health pressures have prevented parents from going back to work. Their parents that have probably just stayed home trying to keep their kids, because that's what wasn't talked about as much. These have been very hostile, brutal, violent school systems since the beginning against especially Black students and other students of color, and so not talked about is how, and we see that in surveys. We've had like several surveys over the course of this pandemic where Black and brown parents are like, you know what, especially Black parents are like, you know what, I didn't like these school settings to begin with, on top of, bullying is still a big problem, whether it's cyberbullying or it's bullying on site. So talk about how do we strike the balance there in terms of, getting to a point where we get households, families plugged back into, expound on that further. You did hint at that earlier, get plugged back into the education system so everyone's getting caught up.
Well, I think you bring up a good point about the Great Resignation. You bring up the point about, since the pandemic, first of all, parents have got to be able to figure out their balance so they can get their kids back in the school that they want. So I think as employers look at what does post-pandemic, and I know everyone's done a lot of reading about this, but these employers have to provide flexibility to those parents, number one, right? And so when those parents have flexibility where they don't have to physically go back into an office, or maybe it's 50%. Yes, you have to go into the office, but back to the broadband, let's get the connectivity so you can work at home, right? You need that connectivity. And when a parent can determine how they're going to feed their families and be able to determine what that education looks like for their children, then I think that's how we strike the balance and get these kids back engaged. Because I truly believe that, you know, the numbers of parents who have taken their kids out of the schools don't want them to return to brick and mortar schools. So what does that look like now? Well, if I have flexibility at work where I only go in, you know, a couple of days a week, and then I'm able to work from home, then I'm able to have my child learn from home. It might be that remote learning, it's distance learning, and it might even be a hybrid of that student's life also, right? Students need the interaction with their peers, right? Maybe that's a hybrid version of learning. So I
Yeah.
think when you look at the family structure and how we strike a balance to get our kids back into a learning environment so we can address these learning gaps and they can continue to learn, is we've got to make sure that family structure is there too to support that.
You know, and to that point, Senator, because I want this to be a very solutions-oriented discussion, conversation, and look at, like, you know, how creative and innovative can we be? How inventive or reinventive can we be? I think that was a term. I think it was either Rand or Zach used reinvent. I think it was Rand. Reinventive in the classroom. So Senator's talking about like hybrid models, but okay, therein lies the tension in that conversation. I'll start with Zach and I'll go into the assembly member in this and then talking about what policymakers can do because, but then there's this tense conversation where traditional educators, teachers, they start getting afraid. Or you know, teachers unions get afraid when we start talking about, hey, well, let's do more of this virtual learning infrastructure. Let's roll that out. You know, they're feeling like, oh, that's going to take something away from what they're doing or makes them more obsolete. And so, no, that's not the case. We're just looking at, okay, what are all these what's this technology that we have? What's the level of access we need? We obviously have an outdated, antiquated education system that has not been working for lots of people. It's like a Prussian military model, if I understand it, that we've been using. That's insane. So go ahead, Zach. I'll start with you first. How do we reconcile those tensions? The role that policymakers could play in doing that.
Yeah. So my first thought is that we don't have time to wait for larger entities like unions or other entities to come to the senses of like, let's do right for kids. We don't have time. So the way I kind of view it is, what can hyper local communities do for their own communities? So when I think about what can we do, I think about, okay, how can we get teacher residency programs set up? How can we get partnerships set up between community colleges and local universities and local high schools to have dual admission programs? How can we get it set up where individuals can look at public data sets and identify injustices and then agitate for change on the hyper-local level? I get frustrated waiting around for larger entities to realize what's best for kids. I've been a unionized teacher and a non-unionized teacher. I've taught in public charter, traditional public, and private. I don't care who you are, if your North Star is not what is best for kids, then you're not here for the right reason. You're not here for the right reason. If your North Star is, well, I want to make sure that we go to this type of school or that type of school, then what you're really about is not kids. What you're really about is your turf. So I get impatient waiting for larger entities to come round. I'm a little bit more about, how can we get this particular school district to change? Be it a large district like New York, which is so huge I cannot even wrap my mind around it, or tiny districts. How can we get this tiny district to be better? I really believe in the ability of individuals in their local spaces accessing public data sets, making partnerships. I feel like partnerships are just waiting to happen. Like we have like community colleges and colleges saying, I wish we could figure out how to attract more teachers. And we have high schools saying, I wish we could get some of our high school seniors to want to become teachers. That's a partnership waiting to happen. And I feel like sometimes it just takes somebody to say, you two need to talk, and flip our mindsets from, well, I don't think that's going to work. Flip the mindset from that to, let's make this work.
Yeah, some good point. Yeah, go ahead, Assembly Member. Yeah, and the role that like policymakers, especially as we're looking at the state legislatures, state capitals have like huge influence over like how the direction that this education conversation is going to go. And see, everyone's now finding that out. We knew that for years, and everyone's now coming around and realizing, oh wow, there's a lot going on in state capitals. You know, especially as it relates to education, voting rights, and other things. But you know that like the role that policymakers can play in reconciling those tensions and also rolling out some of the or deploying some of the ideas that and those partnerships that Zach just mentioned.
So this is twofold. Zach, I agree with you 100%. I have been the community organizer who became the legislator who realized I had to go back to my community organizing roots to change the model. And the frustration is, as a legislator, certain, you know, Senator Williams and I have been working on some legislation and it's taken forever. So I have resorted to focusing on my school district, which happens to be the same number as my assembly district, and forming a local group of almost 200 community parents, teachers, principals to say, look, we have a new mayor and chancellor. We have this plan that we've worked on. We're going to work to make sure we work on this corner right here, because to change this 1.1 million school student system it's big. And I don't want to say it's impossible, but you have systems that are in place and people want to keep it that way. But for right now, I'm just going to focus on this little corner right here. And I've been criticized that I haven't said for other districts that are next to me. I'm like, I get it, but you're going to have to talk to your legislator over there. I'm right now. All I can really focus on is this group right here. And if this works, then I will expand it. But right now, I just have to focus on the 130,000 constituent area I have to really make some impact on how we're helping our teachers and administrators move our students from year to year. And Zach, I wrote down your book. I'm going to read it. I'm going to be in touch. I just want to make sure that, you know, New York City, it's huge. And I realized that sometimes you just have to go back to the small part and do what you can there, because even if I pass the bill that I wanted to pass with Senator Williams tomorrow, the implementation of that is going to take time. But in the meantime, let me just focus on this smaller group right here.
Yeah, go ahead, Senator. Talk about that. So I hear a lot there in what Zach was saying and what the assembly member was saying and how it takes time. Like, what can policymakers do, state legislators especially do? So, for example, like the assembly member was saying, like how you both are working on legislation. Like, I feel like, okay, like when I look at, let's go back to that critical race theory legislation. I look at all the bills, they're identical. So obviously there's a coordinated effort in multiple states to push this vicious CRT law or CRT bills. They all look they're all the same. They're all coming from the same source. So like, it's like, well, can't we be doing that in all 50 states and the territories as far as, you know, like equitable education bills or, you know, hybrid learning, virtual learning infrastructure? You see what I'm saying? Like, I mean, is that movement afoot to do that, to like then have this big wave of those kinds of bills to finally get students to where they are? Which should state legislators be doing, you think, Senator?
Well, you know, I want to first say that, you know, I have to thank anyone who is in public service, because there's an unimaginable huge responsibility on our state legislators all across the country. And while they have, you know, a lot of input and power to take the direction of legislation in their states, is that they cannot do it by themselves. And they have to work with their legislators, even with inside state capitals. You know, they have to work with education commissions. They need the support of community. They need the support of parents. And I believe that's how we can support our legislators across the country. I think that we need to kind of close the gap. How do we close the gap? in getting more of our parents and constituents and coalitions that Zach talked about involved in the education conversation that will support our legislators to make the changes that they need, because they cannot do it by themselves. I can't say that enough. But if you get enough people behind this education conversation, and we can restructure the message, because that's what occurred with critical race theory. The messaging got crafted and it got away from us, right? That's what happened. So I think we have to restructure that message, because this is something that I know the Assemblywoman has worked on. I've worked on when I was in the legislature, is we started an effort across the country to start bringing more curriculum that teaches all children about cultural history in this country, which we know makes them more richer, and they'll be more productive, and they will become better adults when they understand about the different cultures. They talk about that in the classrooms. And I believe that's why critical race theory came about, is that state legislatures across the country were pushing for, adding curriculum. And where, you take civics, you take government, and we're talking more about just Christopher Columbus, right?
Absolutely. Go ahead, Rand. Your thoughts on what legislators, policymakers, how, like the senator was saying, like how do we close that gap, right? Of between the distance between the parents in the communities and the activity, the business that's happening in places like state capitals. Like how do we connect those those grassroots level concerns and anxiety and fears and just frustration with what's happening at the grass tops level?
So that's a really good question. I think that, man, for policymakers, let me just say this. I'm in New Jersey, and in New Jersey, we have legislation in place. It's an Amistad bill that it's called, and where Black history has to be taught in every school, in every grade. That's legislation that was put forth in our state house. And it's something that I'm able to use personally in the classroom. I'm still in the classroom in addition to being a DEI director at my school district. And so that's just proof of what folks can do. Now, certainly in other places, maybe red territories, right, that might not be as easy for legislature or legislators to do. I think that there just has to be an acknowledgement again of history. We think back to, I believe his name was Atwater. It was somebody that was working in the Nixon administration. He talked about what's the thing called the Southern Strategy.
Lee Atwater,
and
right.
Lee Atwater. And so you talk about, instead of using the N-word this or Black people that, you replace those with coded language to galvanize a white populace, white voters, in order to get them on your side. And I think that we need to consider, policymakers need to not be afraid to call that out. That's the same strategy being utilized in conservative circles. Call that thing out, and not be afraid to stand on the truth of, this is something that we all need to know, we all need to hear. A couple of other points. One, I think that to the senator's point, bringing in curriculum, we absolutely have to do that, and we don't have to reinvent the wheel. There is curriculum already that has been developed. I'm thinking about Philadelphia. I'm thinking about Howard University professor Greg Carr and the curriculum work that he's done in Philadelphia that was done a while ago. I'm thinking about, even going back as far as Dr. Carter G. Woodson, who has written books and curricula about Black history and American history and world history, African history, that we can utilize today. We don't have to reinvent the wheel with that. The next point about CRT, I don't know if you were going there yet, but certainly, again, we know it's a smokescreen. We know that it's just a galvanizing point to say we don't want Black history, we don't want other history taught, not the way that it is in terms of truth, but in the way of, we want it whitewashed. We don't want it to be what it needs to be. And so We understand that that's not being taught in K to 12. We understand that it's a legal theory. But I think policymakers, particularly liberals, cannot be afraid to be combative and fight for what our young people need and for what people need, rather than worrying about, can they get reelected? Are they monitoring white sensibilities? They have to be able to stand on their own 2 feet and say, this is right, this is wrong. We're going to fight against that.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's a very good point. So we're about to wrap up soon our conversation, getting schooled. How do we have a better education conversation? We're doing that with the Council of State Governments, Eastern Regional Conference's Council on Communities of Color, and also in conjunction with Stride Learning. Go to csg-erc.org for Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference, or stridelearning.com for more information. You know what I find fascinating too. I'll go back to you, Zach. I noticed that there seemed to be an emphasis since 1954, Brown versus Board of Ed before, and then with the decision and after, was a big emphasis on, okay, we have to, the way to get or to gain a better education system is just to simply desegregate. I'm finding more and more that there's less emphasis in the conversation on desegregating. Like, it's sort of, I'd like for you to talk about that and how we sort of reconcile that, or if that is the way to go, where it's less about, oh, we just have to simply put Black kids in white schools, for example. We have to make sure that this is just, at the end of the day, quality education. It's a quality curriculum, that we have the resources. There's no underfunding, that households have access to technology. It's just a very different conversation. I'm noticing that it's like, it's not just about, you know, desegregation, desegregating communities to gain access. It's about demanding greater investments. Go ahead, Zach.
Yeah, the my knowledge of this is just built upon the work of other folks who've done amazing work. So I want to name that. One of the, I think, unintended consequences of Brown versus Board of Ed is that it centered whiteness as the solution. It said that wherever whiteness is, that's where quality education is. So therefore, what we need to do is simply move Black bodies. What it missed is that the reason for inequitable distribution of quality education was white racism, right? That so whiteness wasn't the solution, whiteness was the problem. And it goes into the critical race theory idea because it's the mythology of Brown versus Board of Ed as this seminal moment when America lived up to its platitudes. It did in a way, but it also did not in a lot of ways. But the mythology of how that's taught, along the lines of the mythology of Martin Luther King, like we white folk, we are taught about I have a dream, but we're not taught about Martin Luther King's fear of the white liberal, right? We're not taught that bit of it. So when I think about Brown versus Board of Ed, and I think about integration, it's not about where the kids go. It's about where the resources go. And very often, if we say we're going to move those folks into these spaces, a couple of things happen. One, it doesn't change the structure that created the racist educational policies in the first place. And two, it assumes that communities of color want to send their kids to areas of whiteness, which is not necessarily a welcoming space for their babies. So why would we assume that they want that? So to me, when I think about Brown versus Board of Ed, I think about an integration as a whole. It can only work if it understands that whiteness is not the solution. Whiteness is not the solution. Whiteness and white racism cause the problem. What needs to change is not where the bodies go, but where the resources go. And I think that's more the crux of the matter.
Assembly member, going into racist institutions and systems. And so, because there was someone who was listening to this conversation, and they were direct messaging me and about, they were talking, for example, about with their young person who's transitioning out of high school into college. And they were explaining how systems federal student financial aid, right? The people who run that that function is based out of places like states like Kentucky, and then we have pretty much the general point, and they're having some problems with that. But the general point that they were making is like, we have administrators, educators, folks who have bought in to racist, biased mindsets. What do we do about that? Particularly, I mean, as you're looking at a state like New York, yeah, we want to provide the resources that we can to teachers, to administrators, to educators, to people who run education systems. But then we have this problem of, some of the people that are in those systems, they're deeply biased themselves. They're sold on perpetuating this racism or this racial animus against Black and Brown and Indigenous and API families.
It is such a great question, and I have a good friend who happens to work for the federal government, and I hope I'm not getting her in trouble, but the implicit biases are there. I'm not sure who mentioned that earlier.
Yeah.
We're talking about Americans who came through a school system where they're not taught about all of the different cultures or what makes America so great, right? And this whole past president who wanted to go back. There are individuals in all areas, not just in education, where the implicit biases are there. It's what they've learned, and at every chance they get, they will block, thwart, misdirect individuals, Black, Latino, Asian, Native Americans from excelling. So for the individual who's looking for financial aid, the person who's reviewing the paperwork, even if it's not a person, if it's a software, who made the software? Are the implicit biases in the software that's being used to filter out students? It is going to take, this massacre, I keep going back to Buffalo, we'll be outraged, we'll be upset, and then things die down, and then it's to the next major shooting. There, in order for our society to change, I believe it's our education system. And whether it's Kentucky, the state houses that are not New York State, we know it's Republican-led, and they're more worried about now, I think it's also misdirection talking about, a woman's right to choose. There's so many other things that are going on in state houses across the country than just that. There's our prison system, there's our homes, there's redlining still exists. So back to your original question. I know with this panel, we could probably go on for hours, but until fundamentally our education systems are changed, we are going to find biases in every walk of life in this country. And I think that is one of the greatest things that holds this nation back.
Yeah, Rand, got a from CSG East, Debbie Ann Page making a rather interesting point. The desegregationists or integrationists didn't have a cohesive plan after Brown. So that also was a big part of the problem, and probably just people not faulting them, but just not envisioning how complex. First of all, not envisioning the demographic changes that we're witnessing now, not anticipating a lot of the very dramatic, bold changes that we're going through as a society, not anticipating the kinds of technology that we have before us, right? So talk about that, about the lack of that cohesive plan.
So I think if we're talking about specifically coming after Brown, I think that there are two things. I think that the segregationists certainly had a plan, right? And the desegregationists had a plan too. And the plan was to just break down the idea of separate but equal, which was really separate and unequal. If you look back into the case, I think that there was a point that Zach made, which was a great point about the idea that you can't assume that Black parents want to send their children to white institutional spaces, being schools that are unfriendly. I mean, when I say white institutional spaces, which schools are, they are schools that are laden and agenda set by white people, where even if Black people enter those spaces, the agendas have been set that they have to maintain them without possibly losing their positions. But when you look back at the case of Brown versus Board of Education, Linda Brown's parents did not necessarily want to send their child to the white school. They simply did that on principle. The case was about principle. The fact that the school was further than their house, the school that they sent their child to, the black school, was further than their house versus the white school, and they absolutely adored the black school. It was just a matter of convenience and principle. And so with that, the lawyers arguing on behalf of the Brown family and others did not necessarily put in the case that that was the point of the case. Rather, they had to fight for the purposes of getting the schools desegregated. And so what segregation, well, I won't say segregation is per se, I'll say what the court did was they were able to utilize that argument to make their holding, that is to say that Black children are detrimentally impacted by not being in school with white children. And so that, I'm not sure if the folks arguing for Brown and the folks in support of Brown were ready for that rationale, right? And so that sort of set the table for how quote unquote integration was going to happen, which meant we are going to take these Black children and put them in white schools with white teachers, with white administrators, and take them out of the environments that were actually nurturing to them. And so I think when we're having that kind of conversation, you know, in terms of what folks did not plan for, I think that this is going to sound really horrible, but I think that there's a level of diabolical thinking that folks that are fighting for justice have to take, because those who are on the side of injustice are thinking 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 steps ahead to counterbalance what is going on. And also my last point on this would be simply that, you know, with respect to fighting for justice, I believe it was Frederick Douglass that said, you know, power concedes nothing without a demand. And what we've been getting over the years have been concessions. And so there's always been, we will give you this concession so that we don't have to do the big thing, right? Not to take this into another conversation, but with police brutality, we have been crying, Black people, for reform, and we have not gotten it. And then the calls for defunding the police elicited the concession of, oh, well, we'll do reform. No, well, we want this because you haven't done that. No, we'll give you the concession. And so I think that what folks that are arguing on the side of justice, fighting on the side of justice, we have to not just simply look for the concession. We have to go for what we are looking for, whatever that is, whether it's complete integration, whether it is, you know, a redistribution of wealth, whether it is making sure that Black and brown children are being educated. We have to go for what it is that we need and want, and not simply look for concession. And I'm not trying to cast aspersions on the Howard University professors that fought for Brown. I think they did an awesome job, but I do think that in hindsight, they would probably argue that there are some things that they may or may not have considered, unintended consequences that have happened as a result of the case.
Yeah, some blind spots there for sure. Zach, just some thoughts, some parting thoughts before we go to Senator Williams.
I think, therefore, one of the things that is incumbent upon the folks who look like me is to do the work of interrogating our own districts. How do we treat our children of color in our districts? Dive into that data, identify inequities by race, by special education designation, by English language learning, identify those disparities, and then construct goals to mitigate them and then make them happen. That is one way we can make change, and as I said before, live up to our yard signs.
Yeah. Assemblymember Williams, your parting thoughts?
Well, I just want to thank everyone for participating in this enriching conversation today. I think we've learned a lot, and there's more conversations we need to have. And we have, the face of education has changed since Brown versus the Board of Education. And we all know what the purpose of that was. What we realize is in the 21st century, that there is still desegregation and there are inequities in education across this country, and we have to address those. And we need to support our elected officials in addressing those issues. We have to involve our parents, and we have to involve different coalitions across the country and come together, and let's make sure that all of our kids are receiving an equitable education. And I think that with the browning of America, we are going to continue to see resistance. And how do we bring our voices forward, everyone in communities of color, and ensure that our kids are getting the same equitable resources as other children are?
Real quick, I want to go back to you, Senator Williams, real quick, but Assemblymember Hyman, just your parting thoughts too, and especially how Rand made an important point. I want to go back to you on this, Senator Williams, because I think I got a couple more minutes. Actually, I didn't realize I had. How like in Brown versus Board of Ed, actually, the parents there, the Browns, they were focused on principle and convenience. Interestingly enough, right? So, and I think that's kind of like we're kind of going back to the original, the way the conversation in our communities is going. It's kind of going back to the origins of what sparked the Brown v. Board of Ed case. Go ahead, Assemblymember Hyman.
I just want to thank CSG East for this platform and all of the panelists. I think, once I get to the point where I feel like I've learned everything, I need to just sit down somewhere. But this position has definitely, I've learned so much in the last 7 years, and it always comes back to the same thing. There's so much work to do. But when it comes to the education of our children, and when I say our children, I'm including white children too, because once exposed to truth, just like Zach, there is so much you can do to uplift others. And as a legislator, as a mother, it's always important to me that I'm moving and in a way where I'm uplifting all of those around me. And I believe that education has been that tool. So the conversations like this have to occur, not just during Black History Month, not just during anniversaries of landmark legislation. I think Debbie Ann Page for the work that she's doing with the communities of color. I'm not sure if I said it right, Debbie, but I think these platforms help all of us to move in a way, whether we're in Philly, New Jersey, Colorado, around this country, and realizing that we keep having to move that needle towards enlightenment and advocacy and activism and anti-racist policies moving forward. And don't think because we're in the state of New York that the pushback is definitely there in communities outside of the city where school boards are really focused on, to me, sometimes it's dumbing down and sometimes it's just keeping the wool over their eyes when it comes to the things that we need to do collectively necessary to educate all of our children. So we have a lot of work to do, but I just want to thank CSG East for having this platform and continuing to do the hard work.
Senator Williams, about a minute left. Just going back to something Rand was saying as far as like that originally that case was based on principle and convenience. It was just, like love the Black schools just farther away. So hey, it's like we need to figure that out. But it just goes back to now here in 2022, 21st century, when we talk about principle convenience. How do we break the school to prison pipeline? How do we get more convenience, more access? And then that goes back to like, okay, well, we need to revisit innovative options like a virtual learning infrastructure, broadband access, et cetera. But just your parting thoughts on that.
I mean, my parting thoughts are that, distance learning it's not the total solution, but I believe it's the next wave that we're having to come to grip with. Some people, are in denial about it. School systems are in denial about it. But distance learning is right in line with where we're talking about technology and how do we deliver that. If you look at distance learning, it's virtual or it's remote, it increases achievement, it closes the equity gap, right? It increases technology access. It actually closes the digital divide. If you think about it, when we give access to technology through education, and it improves communication between parents and between school administrators. So I believe if we're going to have a more equitable environment, we have to bring virtual learning to the forefront and get more people in this country to realize that.
Yeah, so we're going virtual learning. Got to look at, what do we do? What is policymakers do in state capitals? Got to look at funding issues. That's going to be another conversation for another time. Definitely going to be doing that panel. Kind of looking at that funding resource issue. But we've brought it all together. We have to bring this to a close. Our Getting Schooled session. How do we have a better education conversation here live on WURD, being brought to you. We're powered by the Council of State Governments, Council on Communities of Color, of which I am a senior fellow, and Debbie Ann Page is the director of the Council on Communities of Color at CSG East. Want to thank her, CSG East, for making this possible. Also, I want to thank Stride Learning as well for providing some technical assistance. And want to thank our panelists, just going around the table once more. We had former Colorado State Senator Angela Williams, who's also government affairs, public affairs at Stride Learning. Also, Zach Wright, who is author of this fantastic book. It's a short read, too. It's not that long. This man gets right to the point, Dismantling a Broken System. So how do we do that? So Zachary Wright, and also Rand Miller, educator, longtime educator, diversity, equity, inclusion expert based in Camden, New Jersey, and founder of the Urban Education Mixtape, and Assembly member, New York State Assembly member, Alicia Heineman, who has been joining us. She represents the 29th Legislative District in the state of New York, and she has been joining us here as well. Really appreciate her time. I know she's got a busy schedule, as you all do, so I really appreciate your time joining us for this very special 90-minute conversation here live on WURD. I'm Charles Ellison. We're going to hop off in a moment and take a break. Then we're going to come back with open phone lines, get some reactions to this conversation here live on WURD. So let's take a break and we'll be right back for more conversation here live on our special Getting Schooled edition. Stay tuned.
Okay, we're done. I got to jump for real.
Yeah, go ahead. All right. Thanks so much.
Yeah,
Appreciate
thanks
it.
everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so
All right,
much.
thank
Take
you.
care.
All right, good to
Bye-bye.
see
Thank
you,
you.
Angela. All right, bye.